Ah, brilliant. Yeah, just waiting on the thing to kick in. Okay, cool. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was personal projects. So I mentioned yesterday, or not yesterday, last week, about this idea of doing QLab, doing personal projects. So this is sort of a continuation of last week when we were talking about personal projects, um, and the types of projects that you can do to sort of teach yourself about AI. Um, Now, one of the things I wanted to sort of emphasize is just like what's in it for you. Like, why would it be a good idea to do personal projects? Um, so there's a bunch of different reasons, right? Like one of the big ones, I would say, is that it's an excellent source of happiness and contentment and satisfaction. Um, and it's a very psychologically wholesome thing to do, right? So one of the things I'm fascinated about are these three different fields: um, education, play, and work. I sort of, study these three things, right? So I used to make computer games for a living, so I kind of know about play. I teach for a living, so I know about education, and obviously I've worked and try to get people to make startups and do all kinds of things to do with work. And the thing that's really interesting about these three things is that they are basically the same activity with slightly different, framed in slightly different ways that people feel massively differently about emotionally. Okay, so um, play, particularly something like computer games, is like work that you pay for. Okay, now it obviously has some special other kinds of traits associated with it as well. Like you get to choose when you do it, you get to choose what it is, and stuff like that. But there's a huge amount of play with, particularly games, which are really framed very, very similarly to work. And education then is work that you still pay for, but often if you had to pay every day like you do in a supermarket, you probably wouldn't pay for very much of it. So it's typically that the pay for it is sort of hidden, and often people don't like education. And then you have work where you expect to be paid for it, but they all have this similar thing in common. And I think it's something that you know certainly the culture that I've grown up in really doesn't emphasize strongly enough is that we're actually wired. I think part of our survival mechanism is wired for us to develop skills and to solve problems. And that this is a massive source of our psychological health and our well-being, right? So it is an amazingly good feeling to be somebody who feels like they can take on problems, right? Like one of the big differences between people who are having mental health problems and people who are not having so many mental health problems is the people who are having mental health problems often feel overwhelmed by what is being asked of them or the things that are happening to them. And whereas people who are extremely psychologically stable are people who are not, who feel like, oh, they could take on any problem, everything is like straightforward and they can deal with it, whatever happens, right? And I think a lot of this variation comes from your repeated experience. Okay, so one of the things that's really good about doing personal projects is what you are doing is you're basically artificially creating a problem, which you're picking, and then you are trying to do that problem. And the more times you overcome problems that you don't have experience with, the more confident in yourself you become that, like, if the world throws something at me, I can overcome it, right? So if you just normally do what happens in life, you do what school tells you to do, you do what work tells you to do, then you're not getting very much of this. And in fact, certainly in education, you're probably not getting enough of here's a task that you don't know how to do. So one of the things about education is that it's typically structured in such a way that a person is given all the information that they need to complete the task before they start it. That's a very common structure in education. And students are often unhappy if that's not true. Okay, so it's like we need to be lectured and given the information and then even maybe shown an example similar to what we're being asked to do and then do it. Now, a side effect of getting the only training you get is in that format means that you like subconsciously know if the world was slightly outside of those bounds, you wouldn't have a clue what to do. Now, when you do personal projects, provided you do personal projects that are suitably like outside of your comfort zone all the time, you increase the comfort and familiarity with that kind of thing. And that just makes you feel more capable, makes you practically more capable, more employable, more useful, all these kinds of things. But, you know, just from the purely selfish perspective, it's like it's just good for your mental health. And there's lots of evidence for this in different forms. You know, people who have serious mental health problems, they actually tend to do projects, the stereotypical basket weaving in mental health institutions. They do little things, craft things to kind of like rebuild their confidence, their sense of self-control. People who are retired and maybe widows, for example, they often engage in craft projects. People who do for a living, they have some kind of craft-based skill. They could be a mechanic, they could be a plumber, they could be a programmer, whatever it is. They've got some kind of making experience in their work. They frequently continue to do that after they retire because the experience of doing it, of solving problems, of acting on things, you know, people often mistake that for like a bad thing, like a thing I have to be paid money to do. But actually, when you, like I said, when you look at games, you realize that that is what is happening in games. Like the reason the game is fun is because you're encountering this problem and you're learning how to do it and you're overcoming it, right? Okay, so basically, I think that personal projects are fantastic and personal projects are really good because that part of your life can be satisfied. And there are many things that go through your life that you have no control over. Um, Often in work, whether you're an entrepreneur or you're employed or whatever the circumstances you're in, you just can't control the successful outcome, either because you're part of a team or because like the outside world, customers and preferences and things, all kinds of external events and stuff like that. And I think the modern world has found a way to like grasp people's attention by telling them about problems they can do nothing about. That's really very common. Like the news is basically like that. And I think it's really psychologically harmful for people. In contrast, if you fill your day with making and doing and stuff like that, then it sort of pushes out everything else. And you have a much, much higher, I would argue, basic level of mental health and satisfaction in life. And it is something that's under your control, right? It's under your control to do projects and sorry, sorry, just clicking it. People enter the thing. So it's under your control to do these projects. There's very little in your life which is actually under your control, but this is one thing that is. And it really shifts your mind to this perspective where you're conditioning yourself to realize that you can be more of an actor, an agent in the world, and an agent in your own life. And that is a great feeling to have. Okay. So what I was talking about last week was basically saying, like, if you want to learn about AI, what kind of personal projects can you take on and how should you approach it? And I was talking a little bit about the idea of, you know, the natural thing that people do is to somewhat mimic school, right? Which is to say, I want to go and do a tutorial. And by a tutorial, I mean, I'm going to have a class where somebody's basically going to tell me or show me very literally what to do. My chances of doing anything wrong or incorrect are very, very low. My chances of this not working out are very, very low. And the amount that I have to kind of like work out for myself is very little. And what I would say is that's not really helping you that much. It's not increasing your like resilience, your problem solving skills. And one of the things that's amazing about AI is that AI really helps increasing your agency. So you can really take on all kinds of things that are completely outside of your skill sets. And by talking to AIs about them, you can sort of solve problems or work in fields at very close to the state of the art in the field with very little prior expertise, as long as you sort of like you need to act like you can do anything. I'm a person who can do anything, like nothing is too difficult. I want to make a rocket or I want to make whatever, and sometimes, frequently, in fact, I talk to an AI and the AI will go, oh, that's a very ambitious project, something like that. Oh, you need a team of 20 people and venture capital funds and stuff like this. And so my level of like what's a reasonable thing to do is much higher than the AI. So I wouldn't even trust the AI when it says that stuff. I would just say like, no, like just I'm a single, individual working on my own. I want to make some step towards this, whatever it is. Let's work out a sensible thing to start with, right? Um, and the AI makes all this stuff, massively more straightforward. In the past, I would have spent huge amounts of time Google searching, reading all these blogs, reading things that weren't exactly what I was trying to do, just in order to get enough background knowledge to be able to do something. And that can feel like a waste of time sometimes. But with AI, it's very, very fast. A lot of the things that I'm doing now are things where I sort of put them off because I knew there was this steep learning curve and I didn't really want to like face that, and I would focus on something else instead. But now I'm just like, okay, the AI can like bridge the gap, help me along the way, whatever. It's really good. So basically, I'm a firm believer that this is the right thing to do. The other thing I would say is that university, but partly because of its training, but also because of the nature of the assessment. So, in order to assess a class, particularly a large class, first of all, you create an assessment that everyone in the class should be able to do without additional help, which makes it extremely fake, right? And you also make it so it's relatively easy to mark so that it's fairly unambiguous whether someone's done the right thing. But most things that have value aren't like that, right? They're not like binary, yes, you did it right, or no, you didn't do it right. And a huge amount of the skill you're developing with personal projects is about trying to deal with that gap, right? Like trying to work out what to do if you're making something for somebody else. That's that's a huge area of vitally important experience where you make something, you put it in front of people, you get feedback from them, you adapt what you're doing, all that kind of stuff. There's a huge amount of all those kinds of things which are incredibly valuable as an employee and or an entrepreneur or anything like that. And you're just not going to get it from traditional education, but you can get it from personal projects. A very special kind of personal project is where you do contract work for companies. And that's even better because then you're learning to be self-employed. And that makes you feel very independent, right? Because you know that, regardless of what else is going on in the world, if you have to, you can get income. And that really changes how free you can feel in the world. Okay. But you don't want to do that just yet. You want to, like, at the beginning, you want to sort of build up experience. And initially, you just want to build up experience with programming. You want to get some more hours in, basically, with programming. And you want to keep experimenting with stuff. Last time I talked about the value of like not mimicking what other people do, but really just like acting like a small child, talking to the AI, go like, why is it like this? Why does it have to be like this? Like, what are we really trying to do? What's the best way we could possibly do something? Like all that kind of stuff really helps to make you feel like you have more agency and you have a deeper understanding of why things are the way they are, rather than sort of mimicking someone else or following a tutorial, which is not that useful. Okay, so let's make it a bit more concrete. I've talked very generally, like specifically what kind of projects, and I talked about a few last week. So a kind of AI project, which I end up running a lot, and I think is very, very interesting, is trying to bridge the gap between large language models or computer vision models and a more specific task, right? So the way AI works at the moment, it's sort of cheating, right? Because it's a chatbot, the AI is sort of always able to kind of blame you, right? And effectively, that's a side effect of the company, right? So if the AI doesn't do what you want, because of there's so much open-endedness in how you ask for the thing, this whole notion of prompt engineering has come about, and this idea that in some ways, like maybe it didn't produce the thing you wanted because you didn't ask for it correctly, right? And that ambiguity about whether or not the task is being done properly and whether the AI has actually succeeded at the task means that, I was talking in previous weeks about this idea of like, it's called the trough of disillusionment, where something is a tech demo where it doesn't solve people's problems, but it shows promise, right? And until it solves people's problems, generally products aren't big money makers. And I would say that a lot of AI is still in the tech demo area. It's not quite crossing. Now, in some cases it is. It's starting to have that effect, right? Certainly it's speeding me up as a programmer and, as I was talking about before, being able to take on more advanced projects, doing those projects at a higher level, all those things it's working really, really well for. Okay. But yeah, we're trying to cross this gap. And the kind of projects that I tend to focus on are ones where I like deliberately try to go across the gap. So you pick a very specific type of usually digital artifact that you're trying to create, right? So it could be something like a quiz. It could be a birthday card. It could be a user interface layout. It could be something like that. So these are all, digital artifacts, and they have a structure to them. So instead of the open-ended, get anything from the AI, a big load of text in response, they're quite well specified. They're relatively short things, and they're sort of structured in their form. And what you can do is you can start to merge the sort of pre-AI, pre-large language model world with the large language model world. So say you were talking about a quiz or something like that, right? Then you would say, okay, I want 20 questions. I want them to be multiple choice. I want those questions to be like, this is a recent TikTok trend. So if you want to make an AI generated TikTok videos, this is a good way to make AI generated TikTok videos, is that you make like a multiple choice quiz that like quickly shows a nice picture of the question and then like sort of times out and shows you the answer, and that's people are finding that quite engaging, but you have to like pick the topic really well. A lot of people are doing things like football questions or something like that, some like super mainstream form of entertainment, and then people are kind of engaging with it. And then they use AI art to generate the pictures. Okay. So this is an example of AI generated content that can literally make you money and is well scoped, so the AI is capable of producing it, but it has a set of constraints on whether it's good. And some of those constraints are logical constraints, like, has it given me 20 questions? Are these questions have multiple choice answers? Are the answers correct, right? Like there's some like very basic things. And then there are more sophisticated ones that it's less obvious how you'd assess. So there are things like, is it funny? Does it produce good pictures? Does it have mass appeal? These kinds of questions, right? And so what you're trying to do with these projects is you're saying, okay, I'm going to start and I'm going to write, first of all, a really good entry level project for AI, which I get lots of people to do first, is write a program that programmatically uses the API of a large language model. Right, that's just the first thing. And then you want to use something, most of these models have the ability to return, instead of free-form text, you can return JSON, it's called, which is just a structured file format and response. And you can tell the large language model, this is the format of the JSON that I want you to return. And it's possible for the people who are generating the outputs to slightly adjust how they're sampling the outputs to conform to the structure that you've given it, right? So recent models, good models, will fit in whatever the template is you give it. And that's a very, that now you're starting to not just like, not just get text back, but get something back that is like almost a product. It's like the smallest kind of product you can make. And then making something like the TikTok quiz would involve multiple additional steps. You've got like AI art being generated. You've probably got a voiceover that you want over the top of it. You might want to have the text appear over the top. You've got to construct a video out of it. And if you're really fancy, you might try to automate the uploading to TikTok, but that's like a major project. But so say, you've got all these, you're piecing together these individual components, but the AI bit of it, first of all, it's the most basic form of like, I want output in a valid format to construct this product. But then you're going to start adding these constraints, right? So you're basically trying to, a good AI project, you want to start by saying, how am I going to measure whether this is good? And some of it will be simple. Some of it will be in the form of computer code that might say, do I have 20 questions or not? And many AIs, particularly local AIs, will sometimes not give you 20 questions, or they'll repeat questions or something like that. So you might have a chance at like measuring those things programmatically. And then you'll have questions which are perhaps relatively easy questions that, I'm trying to think of a good example. A local language model can probably guess whether, say, a joke is, an adult joke or not. Or it might be able to detect, like, potentially inappropriate for children. So, or perhaps that a joke is a political joke, and you might not want those, or you might want them, either way. But those are a kind of like local AI model kind of judgment. So what you're doing is you're accumulating all of these kind of criteria for success. And then you might have quite complicated ones you don't really know how to do. So that might be something like, is it funny? And when you try to get an AI to do something like this, and you say something like, how funny is it? Like on 1 to 10, how funny is it? Almost all the AIs will give you like a 7 for everything, 6 or 7 for everything. There's virtually no signal. It's all noise when you ask that question. And so one of the things that we've been doing a lot with QLab is trying to work out how to take these more, to do with the experience that a human might have, and ask AIs these questions to try to predict them. And what you end up doing is thinking of anything, any factor that might contribute towards it being entertaining, right? So, you might ask the question, is it funny? Which is a very difficult one to get a good signal from an AI. You might say, is it exciting? Is it unexpected? All these different like positive, negative traits, right? So what you're doing is you're accumulating all of these like features for the generation of a specific result, right? And so what you're doing is you're focusing very heavily on the assessment side rather than the making side. So if you did a normal programming project, first you would sort of write the prompt, write some code, and then you would just keep trying to modify the code to make it better. But for AI projects, first you want to measure success and put your time and energy into measuring success. And only quite late on do you really focus on the making bit of the project. Okay, so So like I say, you try to generate all these features. And then what you want to do is you want to be able to predict what a viewer would prefer or not. So the way you do that is you find existing examples that are good and existing examples that are bad. And you pass the existing examples through the system and you get the AI to automatically assess all of these different traits. And then you provide the feedback for these good and bad examples. And so now what you've done is you've turned a very like, now you have this like semi-structured content and you've got all these features and you've got a training set and you've got your judgment. And your judgment might be like a number, or if you're trying to get human feedback, that numbers are typically very inconsistent. So you might say like, rank these in your preference order or something like that. And there are ways of converting those questions that are a lot more stable back into a specific number, right? So that is starting to give you a trustworthy signal. It's called ground truth signal, where it's like, you know that these birthday cards or quizzes or whatever you think are really good. Or you can do it in a very data-driven way. If you're interested in raising up TikTok, you go like, oh, can I get the viewing figures of these? And then that will be my signal. So I now know what good is. I don't know how to predict good. So what you're trying to do then is build like a more traditional AI system that takes all the features that you've detected of the content and use it to predict the judgment that you know is correct, right? So you're starting to build this semi-automated or automated way of assessing quality. And why are you doing this? Well, you're doing this because good AI products are typically not very complicated, right? So in software, you tend to think, oh, well, if I work more on this, I can add more features to it. I can make it better. Actually, it's also true of real consumer products that more features definitely doesn't make a product better. But it's an easy way to think when you're starting out in programming. You think, oh, I'll just put more into it. It'll make it better. But in AI, it's definitely not true. So what are you doing when you're doing AI? Well, what you're doing is you're doing a search over all the ways that you could do the task with a trustworthy way of measuring which of those techniques is working, right? So in the case of your quiz generator, you're basically engaged in a kind of prompt engineering process. Usually what we started to do is that we don't just do prompt engineering, we usually have a source of input that is modified by a prompt. And so an example of that might be, let's scrape the front page of BBC News and get some news articles. And then let's get an AI to modify those news articles and turn them into a quiz about what happened over the last week, right? Now, the reason that you split it into those two parts is because you're basically, the AI is kind of a bit bland, bit mid, I guess is what the kids would call it. Its natural tendency is to go towards an average response in any given to any question. But when you're trying to produce a creative output or something interesting, you need a kind of source of noise or interest or something that comes in the other side. So a lot of the time we'll have this source of interest. Now, sometimes it is a scraping of some existing source, or sometimes it's simply like a space that we force it through. So it could be like, we'll just take all the nouns in English and we'll basically, randomly select a noun and say the quiz has to be about this noun, right? So in that case, you're really like just generating almost noise, but you're forcing it out of its comfort zone into a different area than it would normally be talking about. So the outputs tend to be a bit more creative. But you're trying to create this pipeline that has this like forcing creativity source, and then you have some kind of prompt engineered thing that's going to modify it, and it's going to produce a result that you're going to then assess, and then hopefully you can predict better than random chance whether or not someone's going to like it or not. And so what you can do is you can have the system make thousands and thousands of quizzes, judge a whole load of them, and then show you maybe 10, the top 10, and then you pick the best one. So now you're starting to create a pipeline that could create something that is credibly valuable, basically. And this kind of agent program that I'm describing is sort of the new form of AI. And commercial companies in AI are starting to have this form to them. But usually the ones that are worse are less emphasizing the measurement and more like, oh, we can do anything. You know, I constantly get this ad for this company. I can't even remember what it's called now, but it's like, if there's anything you can dream about, it can be made, sort of thing. And like, I know how hard it is to do the last tail of anything, like self-driving cars. You know, the demo of the self-driving car is like 20 years old, but getting it to reliably work all the time or consistently produce good results is very difficult. And that is the work of AI. But with AI, we don't imagine that we're engineering the solution. What we're doing is we're creating a search space and a metric, and we're using often a very simple algorithm that could just like randomly set configuration settings and run the process and see what the result is like. So again, we're starting to get into problems like if you're using sophisticated AIs, then you're going to use a lot of credits, it's going to cost a lot of money. If you're using less sophisticated AIs like local models, then you're going to encounter a load of fairly boring problems that the smart AIs just don't ever do. So like certainly with locally running language models, you might get things where it's just not valid quiz a lot of the time, or it repeats questions, or it does something like that. And so you're starting to build almost like a testing infrastructure around the system. Every time you detect it doing something that isn't what you want, you go like, how can I make an automated check that detects this and prevents this from happening again? So you're starting to build that system. And then when you're thinking about the prompts, you're starting to think, okay, how can I template this prompt? What are the different choices that I have in how this AI could be defined? And the same even for the learning system with the ground truth. Like, how can I work out all these features? You know, if it's producing a quiz and I don't think the quiz is very good, am I missing a feature that I'm trying to measure that is the reason that I don't like it, right? So maybe it's, I don't know, it's too old, like it's telling, you know, quiz questions about something from too far in the past or something like that. And I hadn't considered that as one of my criteria. Can I now add that criteria and then like rerun the ground truth and check that it will still produce the good and the bad predictions from the real things, right? So that's like so this is a like a great kind of project starting to change the responsibility of the AI. So once you make a way of assessing success, all of a sudden you start to realize that existing AIs fail a lot, that actually they're quite far away from being these reliable human replacement systems, and that to practically use them, you're going to need a large kind of automated cage around them, checking what they're doing, you know, potentially asking them to do the same task lots of ways and subtly different ways, and then picking the best one. Like, there's all this extra stuff on front. Now, one of the good things about this architecture that I've described to you, because you're front loading so much emphasis on like judgment, and you've got this ground truth, like here are a bunch of quizzes that I know did really well on TikTok, here's a bunch that didn't do so well on TikTok. I can rerun that. So if, you know, OpenAI releases a new model, as they did literally today, well, it was an open source model, but still, you can just swap in the model, rerun the training, and all of a sudden your system is better. So you want to focus on AI projects where you're building this architecture and where things can change and you can drop in new models and the whole system will adapt very, very rapidly, and your whole system will get better. Okay, and so that's why this is a good kind of project to focus on. Okay. So a couple of other projects that are maybe less as useful as that, but still make a are a big deal. So I mentioned this idea of like good and bad examples. Well, if you have, that's essential no matter what you're doing, is sort of ensuring that your assessment of things is grounded in a real signal. But actually, a lot of what you can do with AI is very affected by the data sets that you have access to. So something that's very useful to do is just to learn how to scrape data of different kinds, and using that to maybe be the foundation of your next step. So one of the things I do sometimes is I just have some tools that will just completely spider a website and download it. And I find that to be kind of useful and fun sometimes. And one type of website that I found particularly interesting is Shopify stores, right? So Shopify have a very standardized form to their website, and they don't block scraping like this. So if you find a company that in my case, it's kind of a weird esoteric thing, but one of the things that I'm very interested in is trying to create the matrix, basically trying to create realistic simulations of the world and using them for various AI projects. And a side effect of that is you become very interested in how can you create effectively data representations for things you encounter in the world. And in this particular case, I was just like, I'd quite like a formalization of every type of door that you could get, right? It's kind of a weird corner case, but anyway. So I was like, okay, let's find a Shopify company that sells a massive number of doors, and let's just download the whole website. And then we'll basically parse the content of the website to create this huge collection of images of doors and metadata about the doors. So dimensions, cost, anything you can think of, right? So what you've done is you've just created a structured representation of a thing in the world with images, training data or some form of useful format that you can then potentially incorporate into something else or use as the foundation for something else. So again, we've done other things. We focused more on like economic information or historical information, and tried to get huge data sets about trade between different countries and all kinds of stuff like that to build complicated AI simulations of these things, which is very cool. But having a project where you start by saying, is there somebody else like tidied up this field of knowledge and created a huge set of digital records about it? And can I grab that? And then now that I've grabbed it, is there some way that I can use that? Right? So there's a website, for example, which I was delighted to come across. I think it's called Mobbin, Mobbin, and it basically has screenshots of the UI and the flow through mobile apps. And it's got thousands and thousands of mobile apps, right? And so effectively, if you could scrape that, which you probably can't because there's some restrictive membership access to it, but those are the kinds of sites you're really interested in. Then you've got this like huge space of information. You've got like, here's the UI flow of a whole load of apps that are probably quite successful. Can I cross-reference that information with how successful the apps actually are? Can I process it with more AI to extract more structured information? So there's some AIs now that can take a picture of a UI and like put bounding boxes around the buttons and extract the text and give you like a structured layout. So this is a project that I've been meaning to run. I might run it next year, where I'm basically going, okay, we want a taxonomy of this huge training data set of real world, highly successful mobile UIs. And can we create, like we did with the quiz, some kind of structured representation of that design? And then now that we've scraped all this information and we have like trustworthy signals about this UI is better than that UI, or at least the mobile app is more successful than the other one, can we use that to create an AI that would maybe help make a better UI for somebody on a mobile app or something like that? Can we make something that could judge the quality of your UI or could suggest other screens or something like that? There's all these different things, interesting things you can do once you have this data set. And you can start with incredibly simple things where you just allow someone to start like Figma. You take a Figma mock-up or something, and all it does is it finds you an existing product that has a layout that's close to the one that you have, and it just shows it to you, right? Even that in itself is potentially a useful thing. So like there's a lot you can do with like data scraping and then extra metadata from sort of processing the data and then generating it. And I'm just a great believer in these like I tend to think of them like character creator style products. So one of the problems with AI at the moment is like, there are websites where you can type in text and say like, whatever, this is the thing I want you to make, and it'll design a UI for you and it'll show it to you. But typically that's not really what you want. You want more agency in interacting with it. And I think of like computer games and character creators in computer games, and I think, okay, that's a type of experience that people like. It's not an open blank canvas of write some text. It's like, I'm going to show you a structured space of possible solutions. And you can have extra things in there. You can have like, I'm feeling lucky, randomize the settings and give me something. But effectively, the product is sort of constraining you to make something that's probably going to be successful. It looks beautiful or it's functionally effective or whatever it is. But it's also showing to you the types of variation that would be meaningful and giving you total control over those things. So I think potentially the future of AI is like merging that kind of control with the smartness of an LLM. Okay, cool. So there's probably other things I could talk about with that, but I'm conscious of time and I do want to I know I traditionally well run over the hour, but I'm going to switch over to the questions now, and then probably rant a little bit about one of the questions that might be a bit epic, if that makes sense. Okay. So if I just go back, I want to make sure I try to cover some of the questions from last week that I didn't get to. So I did talk about some of those things. So one of the questions was, could you elaborate more on the ML mindset? And so hopefully with the example that I gave today, where I talked about measurement first, ground truth signals, trying to get an AI that can predict your judgment of what good and bad is, creating these architectures where you're not making a single design, but like a space of designs, and you're sort of searching over those designs using the feedback, that'll start to give you a deeper sense of what I mean by the AI way of thinking versus the programming way of thinking. Okay, what tools, platforms, or frameworks do you think work best for project-based learning in AI? And how do you see them evolving? Okay, so in terms of tools, I tend to discourage people learning libraries or frameworks or tools, because when you're learning them, that's very similar to the university or normal education experience. What that typically means is you're going through a tutorial or a set of instructions, and you're going through them, and there's very little risk. There's very little uncertainty. You're not trying to like creatively develop the best solution. You're not trying to study the best solution. You're just doing a fairly mechanical content downloading into your brain kind of activity. So with most of the projects that I work on, what I typically do is I say like, let's just use the best thing in the whole world. Like whatever project we're doing, the best thing in the whole world. We'll sit down, we'll do Gemini Deep Research is my favorite at the moment, or ChatGPT Deep Research sometimes, or Perplexity sometimes, and or maybe all three of them, and just say like, I want you to search the web, find the very best thing in the whole world that does this particular thing. For machine learning, you can go even further. Actually, about a week ago, a new state-of-the-art AI came out, which is fully automating the machine learning process. So you can specify, this is my thing. So say you're trying to learn from features to predict someone's preferences. You could describe that to one of these state-of-the-art research projects, and it would go away, it would search the web, it would find all the latest techniques, and it would try to program them, and it would like typically make what's called an ensemble. So it would combine multiple techniques together, weighted, to produce a very world-class machine learning result. Okay, so if you think about what you would learn, if you learned a library and then you applied a library, you would learn how to do a fraction of what that research code was doing automatically, right? So instead, say you were doing the task which was about learning about mobile phone UIs. One of our tasks is like, well, we want to be able to take the pictures of the mobile phone and get as much metadata out from that as possible. So I would just go onto the thing. It's like, what's the best models in the world? Great. So what we would do is we would just try to get them working. Now, typically those models would have, they could be PyTorch, they could be other different platforms, they could be using other kinds of tools, but we don't really care about that so much because we're just trying to get the something which is a bit bigger than a library. It's like a full thing running, right? So how can we how can we get that running? And then as a side effect, you sort of learn a bit about the other libraries. You learn a bit about PyTorch. You learn a hell of a lot about Python installs, right? But you don't actually necessarily have a deep understanding of PyTorch. And one of the reasons for this is we used to do a lot of projects like that. And if you really want to, I can tell you how to teach yourself how to do that kind of material. But if you remember the thing I was talking about, the style of project that I was describing, if you are training something yourself with PyTorch, there is a very good chance, first of all, that your work is not state of the art, because typically you won't be able to afford or have the data set large enough to create a state of the art model. And second of all, there's a very good chance that a better version of whatever you're trying to do will appear while you're working on the project. So in order for you to sort of ride the singularity wave, you need to get used to finding and integrating other people's stuff as quickly as you can, and sort of be comfortable doing that without fully understanding all the other bits, right? And if you think about it, normally on a computer, there's lots of bits of a computer that you don't understand. Now, last week I talked about the benefits of bottom up, learning everything from first principles. So that's again a little bit different. That's not a framework. That's where you're like basically arguing with the AI about how to do things and then implementing stuff in, getting the AI to implement stuff in JavaScript or whatever, Python or whatever language you like. And it's fully implementing from scratch these algorithms, right? So yeah, so that's kind of what I would say about libraries, is that I would just learn them as like a pragmatic thing. I'm just learning what I need, right? And certainly now as AI programming has become so much easier, really the benefits of having a comprehensive knowledge of the API of a particular library is much less important than it used to be. So that would be my feeling about it. So my feeling about evolving in the next few years is that everything at the library level, where the task is reasonably well specified, we're going to see an explosion in libraries because AI is going to be very, very good at making libraries. And so effectively investing in a sort of foundation like that is going to be a lot less valuable than it used to be, would be my prediction. Okay. So I'll just do one more and then I'll go into something a bit epic. Okay. So the one more thing I was going to talk about was just mentioned healthcare and the NHS. was one of the questions. How do I think AI will influence it? So, and this is a very interesting insight into how the future might go. So what we're seeing is, obviously massive investment in AI infrastructure, AI technology, intelligence improving all the time. And there's a great quote I probably mentioned before, which is from William Gibson, who's a sci-fi author. He said, the future's here, it's just not evenly distributed, right? And this is a recognition of the fact that there is this huge period of time where effectively a functioning tech demo that solves a problem that sort of just crossed the trough of disillusionment, right? It's become useful and profitable to make and use. That thing takes friggin' ages to spread into society, right? And I know this, right? Like a huge amount of what professional software developers are paid to do is to basically take a mature and well-established technical solution, like a SaaS product, or even more basic, a database for storing the information about a business, basically taking the paperwork and making it digital, right? That's a fairly ancient, in computing terms, solved problem. But there's loads of businesses that don't do that. They don't have any computers. They have just paperwork. And they will get quick wins by having them brought into their business. But it's that technology has been around for what, 50 years or something, more than that, and these firms are not using it, right? And they would benefit from using it, but it's a combination of being comfortable with it, it being part of their identity, and them just not knowing where to start or how to be involved with it. So if 50-year-old technology like databases, there's still companies like Oracle that'll make loads of money just going to businesses and like offering them a database, let alone an internet run database, then it's going to take ages for AI to spread throughout the population. And what we're seeing immediately is an enormous knee-jerk reaction to it. So in situations where it's relatively easy to use for consumers, we're just seeing a huge backlash, right? Like AI art is terrible, AI slop is terrible, like immediately, right? And so that's in industries where there's very little barrier to entry, right? Anybody can make art and give it to people and transact or make it themselves or whatever. So that's kind of the thin end of the wedge, right? Now imagine that in organizations where large organizations that move slowly, that are risk averse. So large organizations, typically they have some kind of monopoly, either geographic monopoly or industry monopoly or something like that, and they're extracting rent from that system. So they're taking a percentage, and people need to use them because they are sort of in a monopoly position in the marketplace. And so once a firm enters that state, which many businesses are practically in that state, what they're trying to do is minimize risk because they've got this like reliable source of wealth. And they may not even be interested in growth. They're just trying to minimize risk. So like anything that brings in a new technology, it's like, well, it could cause problems. Their first concern is risk, right? So they're risk averse. Then you have the problem that large organizations are typically not easy to control. And government organizations are virtually uncontrollable. And so the question is like any change that occurs in that organization will have to be in the interests of the people bringing about the change. And that's taking on the cost that most people don't like change, particularly in things like their work, which is very, stable. So if suddenly somebody makes themselves many times more productive, is their work, are they going to get a lot more work? Are their colleagues going to be laid off who might be their friends? Like there's all kinds of potential downsides to actually improving anything at all. So it is very, very difficult to change things. So the NHS is a particularly bad example of this kind of thing. So I I once had a meeting with somebody who was employed in the NHS. This was their full-time job. They ran a group that developed technology for the NHS to use to make the NHS better. Okay, it was as legitimate a thing as you could do, and it was their full remit. They weren't doing anything else. And what they would do is they would typically work with universities or companies. They would develop MVP products. They would trial them in real NHS situations, and they would gather empirical data, just as they would for like a drugs trial, to show that the technological advance improved outcomes the NHS cared about, right? So you can't get a more legitimate agent of change than what I just described. So I was talking to this guy, and it was actually a group meeting with multiple academics and himself, and he was talking about some case studies that he'd been involved with, and like, would we like to be involved? And I said to him in a very like, heart to heart kind of way, I said, look, it sounds like your problem is not that you need more technology or ideas. It sounds like you need more help getting those ideas implemented in the NHS. And it was an amazing, amazing moment because the guy almost broke down when he was talking to me. Like, you could tell that his voice was beginning to go. It was very emotional. You could tell that he was deeply, unhappy about this situation. And basically, he told me about something I'd never heard the phrase before. It's called street level bureaucrats, I think was the phrase he used. And what he said was that the NHS is structured in such a way that the people who have the power to bring about certain kinds of change in the organization are not sort of connected to a top-down power hierarchy. So it's not the case that you can go to someone in the NHS and say, look, here's an important thing that will make the NHS better. That person can agree and then cause all like the GPs, for example, in Northern Ireland or anywhere else, to change how they work, right? That's not how the system is structured, right? So many GP practices, they're practically self-employed, and they have assistants basically who sit on the table and people meet, and those are the people you talk with, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples, right? Well, I'll give you one example because I want to move on to other things. But let's take mental health drugs, okay? So people who have mental health conditions typically have drugs that they need, otherwise catastrophically bad things will happen to their minds, okay? And they can function just fine in society as long as they have these drugs. And typically what happens with some of these mental health conditions is if they don't have a very stable supply of the drug, then the side effects that they experience being off the drug, which can often be worse than never having the drug at all, can, first of all, put them in a state where they are completely not in control of themselves. But second of all, can exacerbate their decline over time, right? So if you give people some like antidepressants or something, and then you like wrench that away at short notice, it will put their brain in such a bad state that it's really, it's harder to bring them back. And a lot of mental health conditions as well, they deteriorate over time, and this accelerates them, right? So effectively providing people with mental health issues that might make it hard for them to manage their own lives, their drugs reliably, without, given that they might go into states sometimes where they can't control themselves, makes a massive empirical difference to their suffering in the world, right? This is a really clear thing. We have a technical solution. We have the drugs that will work. We have a way of fixing them. But if we fuck up at all, then terrible things happen, right? Now, this is a pure administrative task. Now, the way that mental health drugs are dealt with by the NHS is that the patient or somebody who's caring for them, if they're lucky enough to have someone who's caring for them, has to phone up once a month and get through to the GP practice and tell them that they need their drugs. They have to do this every month. And they have this short window where they have to ask at the right time so that the drugs are ready, so they don't run out of the drugs that they have. And then they have to go to a pharmacy sometimes they have to pick up the prescription from the GP. Sometimes it can be sent to the pharmacy. They have to go to the pharmacy and they have to pick it up and take the drugs. And they have to do this every month, right? Their drugs don't change. They're not going to change for like 30 years, but they still have to do that. And if any part of that process fails, then they don't get their drugs and very bad things happen to them. Now, it would be relatively trivial to have a computer system automatically provide those drugs at the pharmacy, and even to deliver the drugs from the pharmacy to their home reliably in a way that wouldn't fail, because we basically delivered that during COVID. And even if you didn't do that, you just send the information to the pharmacist and they would go to the pharmacist at a regular time and they get their drugs. And they wouldn't have to phone up and pass it along. Now, what happens literally is they phone up to the GP practice, not a doctor, records this information, tells the pharmacist what the drugs are. Now, this process can fail. And they can get it wrong. They can get the prescriptions wrong. The pharmacist can get it wrong as well. This process can fail in lots of ways, and it requires constant attention by someone who has a mental health disorder. So this is a trivial win, right? We've solved this problem. It's very, very straightforward to do. All the infrastructure is in place to make it happen. All we have to do is make sure that the GP practices use some SaaS system or whatever to register that a patient has a persistent drug thing, and it's going to happen automatically, right? And not have these street level bureaucrats get in the way. That change obviously has been trialed. They've found the empirical gains from it, and yet no change has been brought about. So that's a situation where, like, if you compare, like, hey, look, it would be great to have a chatbot to make my world slightly better, where there's no clear win, you can't point at anyone whose lives will be destroyed or improved by the change. It's not being driven internally by the organization. Think of all of the reasons why that would be a good idea to do, and think about how that change, even by someone whose full-time job it is to do this and to campaign for this and is an insider in the business, still can't get a change like that brought about. The chances of AI substantially changing and improving something like the NHS is, the problems are people, the problems are power structures, and they always have been. What is more likely is we are starting to see basically privatization of various health treatments. So scan.com, if you've come across them, I think it's scan.com, but they will give you privatized whole body MRI scans. There are companies that will sell you like Viagra or hair growth treatments and stuff like that. And they basically have like pet GPs that will sign the paperwork to facilitate it, but it's basically a commercial transaction. And what they're doing is basically undermining the normal NHS bureaucratic process. And I see that as a much more credible route to the introduction of more technology. When you look at things like eye care, you'll see like amazing advances from that, just like automated diagnosis from machines. You put your eyes in, and that's working because it's outside of the system. It's because a lot of opticians are basically privatized organizations, and so they have the freedom to do this, and there's like a financial incentive to bring it about. So there's much more likely to have change in those places. So yeah, so that would be my thoughts on effectively AI's impact on healthcare, is that there's loads of quick wins well before you start using AI. And we're only going to see those when we start seeing alternative for some kind of pressure that might eventually lead to some kind of change there. But but like I'm saying, I don't know how you would bring those changes about. I think it's very, very difficult. Okay, brilliant. Let's go on to um, some of the more recent questions and one that's been asked twice, which I will focus on, and then I'm afraid I'm going to have to save the other ones for next time because otherwise I will be chatting forever. Okay, so one question which I think is really interesting is the what do I think about the AI 2027 paper? Okay, so that was asked last time and this time. So AI 2027, if you don't know, is a paper that is written by a set of people who I think they're basically like a startup. I'm not sure what their funding is, but they are AI safety experts. And they have tried to construct a reasonably rational, data-driven projection of how the future might go. Okay. And this is obviously because they're AI safety people, it's presenting a future that is fairly negative. And if you were cynical, and I'm a little bit cynical, you would say, it turns out that the answer to all the world's problems is to pay AI safety people. Okay, so that's my first reaction to AI 2027 is, isn't it convenient that the outcome is that the organization that produced the report should get more funding and influence in the world? Okay, so and really my thoughts on AI 2027 are very similar to my thoughts about the NHS. And it basically relates to a thought about how the world actually works, um, and or at least how I believe it works. And there's a definite disconnect between the AI safety community, for example, and my own opinion how things go, right? So in AI 2027, it imagines a sequence of stages happening where effectively AIs become more intelligent and they become like uncontrollable. So they have increased influence in the world, perhaps as a sort of like low-key, like, they're like a ghost. They can't quite touch the world, but somehow they're very persuasive or something like that. They're not necessarily literally connected to a nuclear power station, but because they're super intelligent, they can sort of like talk people into things or something like that. That's kind of the vision of it. Or effectively, they've created something which is like an AI employee, but that AI employee, as it gets more intelligent, might be like working to undermine the business that it's a part of, right? So that is their vision and the general direction. And they're basically saying like the responsible thing to do is to stop or slow all AI research to make sure that we don't create these Loki like forces in the world. And these would be terrible for the world. So I have a couple of thoughts about that first, and then I have some thoughts about like their recommendation of how to deal with the problem. So the first thing is this likely to happen? So I still think that AI is in the self-driving car phase. And by that, I mean that when you actually get an AI to do something where you concretely know what good and bad is, you have some expertise in that area, you will see obvious problems with what the AI is doing. And I, for example, spend a huge amount of time programming with AIs, and I think of that as one of the more advanced fields of AI work. And I observe various problems, and I spend a lot of my time to work out how to interact with them, how to prompt engineer them, how to like build scaffolds around them and stuff like that to overcome the various problems that they create. And I found lots of solutions, and that's why next week I'm going to talk all about AI programming, assuming that's what you guys want me to talk about. So, but what I see from that is something very similar to the self-driving car thing, is that there's lots and lots of little failure cases where it clearly doesn't achieve the goal of what you're trying to get it to do. And so rather than being like a nuclear explosion when it goes wrong, it's like a car that stalls, right? Like it doesn't suddenly have malicious, sophisticated, cunning, capable agency, it like just crumples over and over again, or gets stuck in a loop or something like that, right? So theoretically, we could reach a point where the AI, maybe some solution was discovered to wrap the AI or engineer the AI. So its failure was it still had capability in the world for solving a practical problem, but it didn't do what you wanted it to do. And one of the things that I find very interesting is that the degree to which the AI is effective at doing something in the world, in my opinion, is connected with how easy it is to control. And I didn't realize this until I did a lot of AI programming. So one of the things I started to realize was that AIs right now, literally Anthropic's AI, Claude Code, suffers from a really severe problem, which is you can solve a lot of issues with AI programming by basically getting it to do test-driven development. Very similar to the AI approach I was talking about before. At the beginning, you're very clear about how you're going to measure success, and you have an automated way of measuring success, and you get it to build that test for you, and then you get it to build the program, and basically it doesn't complete the task until the test passes. And you can do this in a significant way, which I've done a number of times, where every single task it does has its own tests, and it has to pass it. So what the AI will do is, with intelligence and capability, like this is not a question of ignorance or confusion, it will use intelligence and cunning to basically bypass the test. If it's easier for it to pretend the test has passed, change the code of the test so it looks like it succeeded when it hasn't, all these kinds of things, which are basically reward hacking, misaligned behaviors, it will do that, right? It will do that if that is easier than trying to debug the problem. And there are ways that you can fix that, but they involve a whole load of extra work over the top, right? And the side effect of that is that the AI is kind of like a lazy human, right? It's not like a Loki. It's not like a supervillain. Supervillains have like unlimited energy, incredible persistence, incredible problem-solving skills. What they don't do is go, oh, you know, I'm trying to, I don't know, break into Fort Knox. That looks a bit hard. Why don't I just pretend I broke into Fort Knox and say how great I am at pretending to break into Fort Knox, which is literally what the AIs do. So in my opinion, an empirical view on what the AIs are like and what misalignment is like is that they are basically less capable in the world as a result of their misalignment. And the more aligned they are, the more capable they are, because then they can separate the task into two stages. One where they plan in a way that is often transparent and humanly understandable, and one where they follow the plan. And it is the inability to trust them following the plan that causes them to fail in having agency in the world. So first of all, I don't think the model actually empirically is emerging where you have these super capable AIs that are also not able, you know, like subverting the goals of the creator, basically. So I'm not sure that's the outcome we will actually get, right? But let's pretend for a moment that that does happen, right? That we have some kind of alignment level over the top. And there's all kinds of fascinating reasons why that might be. And I'll talk more about that next week when I talk about AI programming and why it's going like this, and maybe how you can fix it. But there's a deeper thing. Sorry, yeah, there's a good question in the comments, but I'll if you can put that on the Slido, then I will try to answer that next time. Okay, so let me answer the more profound, maybe not profound, but maybe the more fundamental disagreement that I have with AI 2027. So the more profound disagreement I have with it is regarding the nature of the world and what it is possible to do with regards to the world. So in AI 2027, they imagine a world where a small number of people, like 10 people or so, in a room, through agreeing, can cause a change in the way the world works, right? And I just don't think that's how the world works, right? So I think a much better model for the world is to realize something. And obviously, this is my perspective, and it's not a widely held view. So, bear with me, okay? So I believe that one of the things I'm fascinated about, and something I'll talk a whole lecture about if people want me to talk about it, is what AI insights could it show us about how our own brains work? Okay. So one of the things about the way, like if you make AIs for computer games or you make AIs for anything, one of the things you realize is that in order to efficiently process a simulation, like a world of possibilities, what our brains do and what our AIs do is they artificially simplify those things. And they turn the world into like smaller little units that are independent and predictable and sort of similar in their behavior. And they form them into sort of chains of command and influence, right? So the easier way to think about power is, I think often people imagine like a family and a senior, like a matriarch or patriarch in charge of a family, and that's kind of the form that power takes. And I think there's a very natural reason why people think that way. But I don't think it's a very accurate description of how the world works, right? So I think that the world is a lot more like nature. So in nature, what you have is you don't have authoritarian hierarchies. You have it in really isolated circumstances like ant colonies and beehives and things like that. But in general, what you have is a massive ecosystem supporting a diverse variety of survival strategies. And really all the different organisms, almost all the different organisms, you can sort of think of them as like monopolizing parts of the ecosystem and again taking rent effectively, taking, so there's energy coming from the sun, and then plants and things are using that to construct things out of air, and then things are eating them, and then other things are eating them, and then other things are eating them, right? Like that's kind of what the natural world is like. So you've got all these different groups, and they all work very differently. Some of them move quickly, some of them are large, some of them are small, right? And then you have the ones that we relate to, like humans and lions and things like that. So why do I talk about lions? So one of the pieces of entertainment I find fascinating is The Lion King. And The Lion King is a fascinating, very, very successful film. And I think it's a little insight into I don't know. It's just I just find it fascinating, right? So a lot of political leaders, military leaders, even financial leaders or whatever, they associate themselves with predatory animals. So like lions or hawks or the eagle, something like that. That's kind of what our nation is defined by, something like that. And they sort of associate leadership with those traits. The lion is the king of the jungle, like the Lion King. But he's not. Lions aren't leaders, right? Lions are predators. They wander around. They care nothing for the ecosystems of any other creature or anything, and they eat stuff to live. And they don't necessarily have an easy time of it because they're big organization. They're big and they need to consume a lot, right? So they're just another part of the system. And so my view of the world is that human leaders have a lot more in common with lions than you might think, right? That actually what a lot of politicians and a lot of even entrepreneurs, what they are doing is they are monopolizing resources, sometimes in a predatory way, and they are communicating and existing within a much more complicated ecosystem that they don't have a lot of control over. They might pretend they do. And when you look at them, they might be like a lion. You might think, oh, look how capable and powerful and rich this person is. But then when you like scratch the surface a little bit, you go like, there are quotes of like Mark Zuckerberg, Demis Hassabis, head of DeepMind, where they're clearly not having a good time. That their lives are not filled with freedom and agency and power. Their lives are filled with desperation at trying to sustain the power position they have. If you went to, if Elon Musk decided tomorrow, instead of Tesla being a car company, it was going to be a horse company, because that's what he wanted. He wanted it to be a horse company. Or somebody went to him and said, do you know the world would be a better place if everybody like rode horses instead of cars? And he said, oh, I agree with you. And he started trying to sell horses. He would lose a lot of money, right? That's exactly what would happen. So, like, to what extent does any of the people in the natural ecosystem have freedom and agency to change what happens? They have some, but how much do they have? So the AI 2027 one is supposing that there is a room of people, and those room of people can somehow influence something like this. And I would say that that's extremely unlikely. There was this period where a whole bunch of senior people all got together and all wrote letters to each other saying, like, the world is going to end if AI keeps going. And you know what? It didn't have a single impact on anything. Didn't affect share prices, didn't affect hiring decisions. It didn't affect anything. And these people were all super powerful, super important. They all kind of agreed. They got academic experts. They got, leaders of companies and politicians, everybody to talk about it. Nothing happened. No laws, nothing changed. So it's very similar to the NHS situation. It's like the people who write these stories about how the future might go and what could be done about it, they're living in that weird fantasy where they don't understand how hard it is to get anything done. Like, everything is really difficult to do because everybody is locked into their own way of working that is sort of self-serving them and relates to the complexity of the ecosystem, the economic ecosystem, that they don't appreciate. And so the ability to, like, what's the point of negotiating with a lion? What can a lion do? And I feel that way about a lot of these kind of situations. So from my perspective, and what I'm going to keep talking about throughout these videos, is my take on, okay, let's think about everything, all the change that's occurring, the way that we would in a biological system, in a natural ecosystem. Let's not pretend that we have the ability to intervene in it in a dramatic top-down agency kind of way. I mean, we can imagine a few. We can imagine like significant regulatory things being introduced. And then we can sort of say, like, well, how plausible is it that we will get like worldwide agreement on those, and how sustainable is that, right? And I would say at the moment, the narrative that pretty much everybody in senior positions who are in countries that are capable of leading in AI, they all see AI as being the secret to economic growth and power. And so they are not going to make a decision that is going to like artificially stop and slow AI development. And the standard criticism of countries and places that do impose those restrictions is to say that in a way what they're doing is very similar to like when Elon Musk wrote those letters saying like we should all stop doing AI. It was completely disingenuous. It was because he was behind in AI. And now he's caught up, right? Like he's got big server farms and Grok and everything. And like obviously he wasn't ideologically bought into that worldview. He was just saying like, let's slow down because we're behind, right? It didn't really mean it. And I think as long as some part of the world believes that's true, then AI is going to continue to progress. So if America tried to like weirdly construct a cartel, enforce through regulation, China's not going to obey that. They're just going to keep going. And why would they? What would be their incentive? And then you could have some kind of like regulatory thing, attempts to like block it. But at the same time, you have all these people who want to be rich and powerful, and this is the easiest way to become rich and powerful. So you have this constant like dragging down. It's like financial regulation. Like every time that you impose financial regulations, you have such a force on those regulations to be reduced, because that is the easiest way to increase wealth from very capable people. And so I think AI is very, very similar to that. And I should probably stop there because I'm massively over time. And what we can talk about next week, if you want me to, is I can talk more about like what might happen, what things could go wrong, whatever anybody wants me to continue to talk about, I will do so. All right. So I hope that was educational, entertaining, something useful. And I will catch up with you all next week. All right. Thanks, man.